At February 1942, Bangka, an island south of Sumatra, a palm-fringed atoll of mud and salt water where heat seems to breathe through the walls of the improvised shelters. The British patrol boat waves in the distance, but the dry smoke of gunpowder fills the air as the order rings in the listening ears. Forward, hold position, do not retreat. Vivian Bullwinkel, a flight lieutenant and commander of a medical team on occupied territory, watches the seam line between the pale blue sky and the restless sea. The scent of iron and ozone sticks to the uniforms. Boots strike the weathered wooden deck, each step marking the beat of a nerve that cannot tell whether it is fear or hope. The tangled fabric of battle begins to reveal itself in torn canopies and improvised tents that serve as a field hospital. Philippine and Malaya, at last distant, still seem near enough to touch the skin. The wounded arriving bear injuries that should not exist. Deep cuts, burns, the weight of a bullet that interrupts a life with a single moment of fate. Bullwinkel moves among wooden beds, improvised anesthesia, forceps gleaming under the dim lamplight. She checks the pulse of a man whose breath is a strained whisper, places a basin of warm water on the forehead of a young woman who does not know if she will wake. The sound of delivery wagon wheels cuts through the suffocating silence. Gas masks rest on the shoulders of nurses, who know that every minute without care is a life slipping away. In the distance, the sound of hurried steps and shouted orders cuts the air, severing the quiet that remains of a morning medical routine. Japanese soldiers with their helmets, the cold steel that seems to carry no human warmth, approach the beach, the sound of artillery wheels beating out a cadence that makes the ground tremble beneath the feet. Bullwinkel grasps the instant gravity of every decision. Keep the doors open for the wounded to exit or close the ambulance corridor to prevent the flow of blood that pours like a waterfall of iron. She chooses to save lives one by one, repeating to herself that every breath restarted is a vote for survival, not for herself, but for those who stay to tell the story. The first explosions arrive like muffled thunder, casting shadows that dance on the canvas walls. The heat rises, stagnant water smells of rust, and the floor becomes soaked with a mix of sweat and pain. Bullwinkel knows war is not only about maps or strategies, it is about the human body that sustains, bleeds, and suffers. She bears the weight of a doctor who has become a shield. The jacket, now stained, becomes a second skin that protects the wounded from a world that seems to have forgotten humanity. Amid the chaos, she hears the creak of a door that should not open, the whisper of an air current that carries the scent of oil and gunpowder deeper inside. The wind brings the distance of an island still breathing, but the water is no longer calm. The first night arrives with a darkness that seems to have substance of its own, studded with stars that do not see what the eyes see. Bullwinkel moves among patients, adjusts bandages, murmurs words of encouragement that sound more like soft orders given to herself. Time is a precious coin. Every minute spent saving someone is less time available for the enemy to approach too close. The sound of an improvised siren signals that a new wave of wounded is on the way, and she, with steady hands, guides another nurse to the front line, where the improvised hospital becomes a frontier between life and silence. The next morning reveals what the night concealed. The sky remains unanswered, the sea seems to hold its breath, and the island guards secrets in the gaps of coconut trees and the pebbled shores. Bullwinkel looks around and recognizes the weight of her oath: to serve, to protect, to retain the dignity of every man who crosses the operating room door, regardless of origin, color, or loyalty. The caregiving routine does not stop. The need for protection is greater than any pride. She understands that war makes no winners on Bangka, only survivors who will carry invisible scars that can speak louder than any medal. Continuing into the next morning, the heat rises like an invisible blade that cuts the air between improvised tents. Vivian Bullwinkel, already known among the nurses as a pillar, takes a deep breath, feeling the insistence of a new influx of wounded, arriving in wooden wagons and in eyes that plead for rescue without words. The field hospital, a collection of canvas hung between trunks, gains fortification contours, wooden battens holding the curtains against the wind, boxes of medicine lined up like ammunition for an invisible artillery. The distant sound of engines and sirens reveals the Japanese draw nearer than expected. Bullwinkel recognizes the rhythm of marching troops, the click of radio switches, the creak of cables supporting the generator that keeps the operating room lit with each high-voltage flicker. A young nurse, hands still shaking, holds a syringe. Bullwinkel approaches and offers a dry keepsake, a folded handkerchief, a brief kiss of courage so the young nurse remembers to breathe between the orders to save. The battle takes on the form of a grim engraving as the first bursts of artillery cut the shallow waters of the beach. The sound of the waves becomes a cadence of danger. On the shore, rifle fire etches the sand, and the shadows of soldiers fall like pieces on a board someone forgot to sweep. The Japanese officer, with insignia on his shoulder, observes the coastline with cold eyes, timekeepers calculating the next advance. The order to capture or eliminate sounds almost like a melody without harmony, repeated until it becomes a terrifying certainty. Bullwinkel, with the precision of one who has done it all to keep alive, organizes evacuations with a speed that seems almost improvised, but is the product of drill and discipline. She coordinates a small team to move the wounded into the interior of the tents, while rolls of bandages feed into a sewing machine, improvised by a volunteer with sewing expertise. The scent of anesthetics mixed with salt and sweat creates a catacomb-like atmosphere lit by the flicker of lamplight. Each life saved is a point of honor for the nurse who vowed to protect, even when the world around seems hungry for vengeance. As night approaches, the seawater grows cold. The distant roar of combat becomes a tide of silence, broken only by the contained sighs of the wounded. Bullwinkel checks the pulse of a man with closed eyes, recites in a low voice instructions learned from manuals, but which at that hour sound like a prayer. Keep breathing steady, maintain a stable temperature, keep humanity intact. Each decision weighs like steel. Keep the hospital entrance open or reinforce internal protection, keep patients stable or make room for those still savable. The siege closes first in the perception of onlookers. The coast reads like a borderline between two worlds. An elderly woman, wounded, whispers words through clenched teeth, asking for water. Bullwinkel approaches, gives her the remaining water from a bottle, promises that everything will be fine even without tomorrow's guarantee. The sound of footsteps in the brush around reminds that the line between medicine and battle is too narrow for most, and that the hearts of those working in the field hospital can also fail under pressure. Still, the nurse remains steadfast in the conviction that life has the right to prevail even when the map is stained with blood. At the end of the night, the beach gates seem less like an hospital entrance and more like a vigil of memory. Bullwinkel regroups the teams, checks supplies, folds the blankets to keep the bodies still vibrating with human warmth. The wounded, some unconscious, others only partially conscious, receive stabilizations, while the ocean's water continues to watch, impassive as if aware that the line between life and death is drawn with every counted breath. The coast becomes a picture of hot irons, where salt jiggles in puddles of water and a curtain of smoke rises from improvised bonfires. Amid the unceasing roar, Vivian Bullwinkel advances with firm steps, each one marked by the cadence of boots that do not retreat from horror. The field hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, becomes a line of defense that moves as orders slice through the air. Patients carried from one side to the other, with improvised tourniquets with cloths soaked in alcohol and the determination etched on each nurse's face. The first wave of violence arrives not only as gunfire, but as a silence that says now. A sergeant, his uniform muddy, grabs a gurney, the metal creaking under the weight of carrying a life that swings between hope and surrender. Bullwinkel bends to adjust the cervical collar of a young soldier, hands trembling for just a moment, swallowed by the need to stay calm. Time is the true adversary. Every counted breath is an opportunity to keep someone alive, each passing minute a chance gone to see someone break. On the other side, Japanese troops approach with unsettling precision. The smell of gunpowder, the dry sound of steel being drawn, the crack of muskets sparking on the wet sand. An officer with a shoulder badge surveys the scene, calculating safeguards and abatements, where to place syringes, where to make way for faster evacuation, where to reinforce the canvas barricade to deter the advance. Orders are given with a coldness that seems to train the human heart not to feel, yet Bullwinkel reads in them the language of fear that dwells in every man, including those who should protect them. The narrative centers on the crucial moment when the situation shifts from saving to saving under extreme pressure. The routine of dressings becomes a choreography of emergency. Nurses, volunteers, and doctors work in hurried unison, holding limbs that swing, tightening tourniquets with almost mechanical speed. A young man with a lip cut by shrapnel tries to speak, but pain cuts his voice. Bullwinkel replies with short words, simple orders that function as a mantra to maintain composure. Breathe, focus, keep the life-sustaining flow in every second that passes. The Bangka massacre, when it finally settles into a living memory, is not just a record of violence, but proof of what happens when humanity must choose between fear and compassion. Bullwinkel, with the discipline that made her a reference, makes decisions that defy the cruel logic of war. Some lives cannot be saved, but every life that can be protected is a battle won against despair. Amid the chaos, she rises as a bastion of courage, a physician who knows that the oath is not merely a signed paper, but a continuing promise to protect human dignity, even when the world falls apart around her. The heat intensifies, the horizon glows with fire, and the sound of gunfire seems to turn time into a spiral of fear. When the night falls a second time, Bangka Island remains a territory of shadows, where the insurgent noise echoes through the coconut trees, and improvised beds still tremble with the weight of the wounded. Bullwinkel, with her uniform smeared with dust, lifts her head with the dignity of one who knows that the legacy is not a trophy, but a responsibility. To keep alive, even if only in memory, those who fought beside, those who did not survive. She records in her mind every detail: how many wounded can still receive transfusions, the hours of vigilance left, the words that must sound like an oath. When the withdrawal is complete, a silence weighs like a velvet curtain. Attentive ears catch the final crack of wood in improvised frames, the faint buzz of a generator still running, the shallow breathing of those still trying to find strength to speak. Bullwinkel gathers the remaining, issues final instructions, and promises that the story will not end there. Every life that crossed the field hospital door carries a memory that does not fade with time. The sun lowers on the horizon, turning the sea into orange hot, while the distant sound of gunfire becomes the memory of a battle not yet told in full. In the last light of the day, a nurse reads aloud the names engraved on a blood-stained list, tokens of longing, promises of care, vows that no effort be forgotten. Bullwinkel, farther away, watches the line where the horizon meets the sea and knows that the Bangka Island story did not end with withdrawal. It just changed form, becoming a memory that must be repeated, studied, told with care, so that humanity does not repeat past mistakes. As the day ends, the image of Vivian remains etched in the viewer as a silent beacon, not only a doctor who saved lives, but a voice that insisted on remembering the price of courage. The ember of the day gives way to a quiet night, but Bangka Island does not sleep. In silence, the voices of those who stayed reverberate among the trunks of trees and the distant clinking of broken glass in empty tents. Vivian Bullwinkel, now a symbol of quiet resistance, holds a worn notebook where names, times, and small gestures that made a difference were recorded. Each line is a photograph of a life: the doctor who insisted on keeping the consciousness of a man in terminal state, the nurse who kept a child's hand so she would not feel fear, the volunteer helper who raised a curtain with only a token of courage. The images return to the viewer like fingers sliding across the surface of old glass, memories that shine when exposed, and that, if not told, would be lost forever. The Bangka story, therefore, is not only about gunfire, wounds, and withdrawal. It is about the transformation of an ordinary person into a symbol of humanity under extreme pressure. Bullwinkel did not become the sole survivor of a massacre merely because of luck. She became the voice that recalls, the moral compass pointing toward care, even when circumstances push toward the opposite. The colors of the scene change with the seasons of time. Sunrise brings clinical clarity, clothes neatly laid out, gloves perfectly folded, the precision of someone trained not to fail. The sunset, on the other hand, wraps everything in autumn tones. Long shadows, the breeze carrying the salty smell of water, and the memory of unkept promises. In every face Bullwinkel passes, the question remains: what remains when everything known is emptied by violence? The answer lies in the persistence of maintaining human dignity, in the refusal to let cruelty determine who becomes a hero. Historically, the Bangka film unfolds as a network of causes and consequences. Bullwinkel's courage influenced future decisions, shaped standards of medical conduct in combat situations, and fed a collective memory that helped mold international understanding of war atrocities. The narrative ends with the hope that memory becomes learning, that future generations recognize the importance of protecting human life, even under the worst pressures, and that courage is measured not only in battles won, but in compassion kept alive amid wounded openings. In the final moments, one last glimpse of the sea. It is not merely a backdrop but a witness to continuity. The waves that come, recede, and return, like questions that insist on remaining. Bullwinkel's voice, persistent, echoes like a beacon. History is not to be forgotten, but to be remembered, studied, and honored. And for those watching, a silent responsibility remains to keep memory alive, not to glorify violence, but to acknowledge the dignity that, even in the worst, can still shine with the strength of human compassion. If you enjoyed following the story of Vivian Bullwinkel and Bangka Island, consider subscribing to the channel to not miss episodes exploring moments forgotten in World War II.